Now that we've done your twining, the next step is to do several rows of plain weave. The plain weave is going to do a similar thing to twining where it helps lock in this base area of your weaving. It will happen before you do tassels if you're going to do tassels. The plain weave will require you to have a piece of string that's about 4 or 5 times the width of your frame. You'll want to have a comb or a fork. Those will be used to tamp your weaving down to make it tight. And then you may want to have a dowel. Not necessary, but if you want that, you can use that. So go grab your materials, and when you come back, I will be ready to show you how to do the plain weave. Okay, when we're starting a new string in a weaving, the important thing to know is that you do not want to start anywhere within this zone, a few inches or 2 inches or so from the beginning or the end of your warp. And the reason for that is when we start, we leave a little piece of the string hanging out the back of your weaving. If you start too close to the side, it's likely that that piece will hang out the side of your weaving and it won't look very nice. So what I mean by that is, here is a loom that has already been started, and I'm going to flip it over and you can see the back, and you'll see all of these starts and stops that has been done on this weaving. And when the full weaving is done, we'll go through and we'll sort of tie them off to a close by string so that they don't come out. But we want to make sure that this amount of space here, so this is about 1.5 inches, is the closest that would really be to the start of your weaving, so that when we clip these little strings after we've knotted them together, the tail doesn't stick out the side. So notice they've done a pretty good job. This one right here is a little too close to the edge, so I might actually back weave that through a little bit. So the bulk of your tails will be in the middle. And again, this is the back side of your weaving. This is what we'll see from the front. Okay, so there's 2 ways to start. One way to start is by just dropping a couple inches of string down into your weaving like this and just leaving it there hanging. And now we just go over, under, over, under. And notice that I'm not pulling very hard while I'm doing this. And the reason for that is if I pull hard when I'm going side to side, it will really quickly start to pull these side strings in. So I'm going to leave this relatively loose, and I'm going to use the fork or the comb to push this down. Pull it a little tighter than that. And then I can keep going over, under. So this is one way. This is just starting your weaving from one spot. Hopefully my head didn't block that whole thing. And you can just go all the way to the end, come back, and you keep weaving. I know that there wasn't any weaving right here, but that's okay. As you come back, that will get filled in, and the yarn is pretty thin, so even if ultimately you go back and forth and you get several rows built up right here, but you get one less row built up right here, when we push it down together, you really aren't going to notice one width of string difference in the width. It'll even out pretty well. So that's one way to start. And this is kind of the way that I typically start for all of my weaving, as I just drop a little tail in and keep going. I think it's a little bit easier. But there is another stitch that people like to do. It's called a back stitch. So I'm going to go ahead and pull this out. And with a back stitch, what we would be doing is taking the end, and I'm going to go over and under a few of these strings here. So I'm going to pass it under a few of them, like this. Drop that tail back into the back. And now I can wrap this around the outside and come back. And now it's the same thing. I'm still just going over and under, but rather than just starting with a small area that was sewn, I can do this double area. It kind of locks it a little bit so that when I start pulling, if I were to tighten this area here, it gives me something a little extra to pull against. So again, that's not necessary to do a back stitch, but you can. It doesn't do anything differently really than the just starting stitch like I showed you. And ultimately we're gonna go all the way to the end and back. So a couple things that I'll do to make this easier for myself is I will notice that I'm gonna go under this one and over this one. So I'll go through and I'll just pick up a handful of the ones I'm gonna go under, and I can put my hand under like that and pass that whole ball of yarn underneath that. So I'm gonna loosen up another section here and pick up every other one for most of this row. And then I've got one more trick to show you with the dowel. So again, I'm not pulling tight. Okay, so I just got down to the end. And now I'm going to take the comb and I'm gonna tamp this down. I'm gonna wrap around this one. And then I'm gonna keep going over under, but there's a cool trick that I can show you here, which is if I take this dowel and I pass it through the top of the frame and I slide it down like this, I've just created space between every other one of my strings. And what you'll notice with it this way is that it's creating space in the areas where I need to go through. So I'm gonna be able to take this ball of string and just pass it all the way through without having to pick up and figure out which string is the one I'm supposed to go under. So just pass it all the way through, down to the end. And again, pulling gently, I don't want to pull tight, and I'm going to tamp it down. The thing about this trick is that it will only work in one direction. I can't pass it back through with the dowel there now because I would undo the row that I just did. So if I'm going to come back the other direction, I need to slide this back up so that it flattens out my warp again. And I would go around this outside string, and then I'm gonna just go ahead and do what I did the first time down and pick up every other string and pass it through. And I'm gonna do this until I run out. But what I do wanna notice is if I'm ending my string close to the edge of my frame, I'll want to either backstitch it or just stop somewhere before the ends, and leave that tail hanging out the back. So anywhere in the middle, as long as we end somewhere in this middle section. Once you've done your plain weave for at least 3 or 4 rows, then we're ready to do tassels, and I'll show you how to do that next.